Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Kelly Caseman, Executive Director of Think Kids, and we are joined today by Dr. Michael Bromwich to discuss ACEs and the opioid epidemic. For those of you watching live on Facebook, you're welcome to add questions or comments below the video. Our intern, Maddie Lavoie, is with us again this evening, and we'll turn to her a couple of times during the hour to see if you have any questions or comments to share. So let's begin by introducing Dr. Michael Bromwich, former medical director of Cabin Creek Health Systems and former co-chair of the West Virginia ACEs Coalition. Mike, would you like to tell us a little bit about what you're doing now? You're on mute.
I guess that helps a little bit. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here to speak about one of my favorite topics, which are adverse childhood experiences. Obviously, the opioid crisis is not one of my favorite topics because it's hurting and killing so many West Virginians. Currently, I work for a federal agency in Washington, D.C. I want to make a disclaimer right up front that any views or opinions that I share here are not representative of the Department of Veterans Affairs and do not represent any of their policies. The viewpoints that I'm expressing here today are strictly my own. But yes, so currently I do work for the Department of Veterans Affairs, doing something entirely different.
Well, great. So tell us a little bit about your background and how you got interested in ACEs.
Well, thank you, Kelly. My background is that I'm a physician. I was born and raised in Fairmont, West Virginia. And as I went through medical school, I was initially an internal medicine physician. And a lot of what I saw as an internal medicine doc was people with, the long standing effects of obesity, of diabetes, of high blood pressure. And so we saw a lot of people with end organ disease. And so I was really kind of interested in, what might I do differently to go upstream from the problems I was seeing and hopefully be able to affect change that would lead to better health outcomes later in life. So I became interested in preventive medicine and looking at ways to try to affect that. And I noticed that it was really hard to get people to change their behaviors. And I was wondering kind of what's behind all that. What are the things that are really driving people to smoke cigarettes, use alcohol, use drugs? So I had a sort of a breakthrough in a personal breakthrough in the mid 2000s when I learned about this study called the ACE study, or adverse childhood experiences. So that was really kind of what got me on the roll to looking at deeper things that are happening to people very early in life that have, on a population basis, adverse outcomes as adults. Now, I want to be very clear up front that, as we're talking about ACEs and ACE scores later on, we know that there are people with high ACE scores who do very well in life. So this does not mean that you are condemned to a life of poor health if you have a high ACE score. And we'll talk about that, I'm guessing, throughout this time that we have together, about what things we can do differently to change the trajectory of ACEs.
Okay, so can you recap on what an adverse childhood experience is?
Yeah, so what we're talking about when we're talking about the original ACE study. So this study was done by a friend of mine, actually, Dr. Vincent Felitti in San Diego, California. He was working for a large health maintenance organization called Kaiser Permanente, one of the largest in the United States, an integrated healthcare system with excellent health outcomes. And he did this study really around obesity, but had an understanding that things that happened early in childhood had these adverse effects that he was witnessing in his clinic in San Diego, California. So he did a large study with over 17, eventually over 17,000 Kaiser Permanente beneficiaries. So people who go to Kaiser, by the way, are sort of mostly middle-class Americans. They can afford good health care. So we're not talking about people who are generally homeless or afflicted by a lot of things that we tend to think of with, problems with lower socioeconomic status and so forth. So he did this study based on his observations in his clinic with, like I said, over 17,000, and was published in 1998 in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine. And it was a landmark study. And in fact, it was such a landmark study that the American Journal of Preventive Medicine recently republished the original study. And it's had a profound effect in America. So when I first started talking about this in the early 1990s, in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, people really hadn't heard of it very much. A few people did, but now it's become much more widely known. So what are we talking about here? In the original ACE study, there are 10 different categories. So based on those 10 categories, all of us have an ACE score somewhere between 0 and 10. So what I'm talking about specifically is emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. So 3 categories of abuse: 2, neglect, emotional and physical neglect, incarcerated member in the household, 1 or both parents missing from the household, domestic violence, specifically toward the mother, mental illness in the household, and drug use in the household. So those are the 10 ACE categories. And these are generally yes and no type of questions, and they're asked in a very specific way. But you can pretty quickly add up your ACE score. And so what they found out is, there seems to be a really dramatic jump in adverse health outcomes if you have an ACE score of 4 or more. So for example, you're 12 times more likely to attempt suicide, 10 times more likely to use drugs, 6 times more likely to use alcohol, 6 times more likely to have a teen pregnancy. So really sort of profound effects. And then if you get 6 and above, in one study, they showed that men with a score of 6 or more were 46 times, not 46%, 46 times more likely to inject drugs. So it's really got these profound effects that last not just during childhood, but have profound effects over a lifetime. Again, I want to go back and say that just because if you have an ACE score, just because you have a high ACE score does not mean you're condemned automatically to a life of misery. We're talking about on a population basis. The other thing is on a population basis, those with a score of 6 or more were on average living 20 years less than those with a score of 0. So really just a very, very dramatic sort of things.
Okay, so looking at ACEs in a wider context, what are adverse community environments?
So that's a very important question. So thank you for bringing up this slide. I think this a tree slide that came from George Washington School of Public Health really kind of explains this very well. So I've just talked to you about adverse childhood experiences, which is the top part of the tree, obviously. So we're talking about domestic violence against the mother, substance abuse, emotional and sexual abuse, and so on. We've talked about that a little bit, but beneath that, below the surface, are these other sort of things that are happening, including poverty. Discrimination is it one of those adverse community environments. Community disruption, as we see in Appalachia with the loss of good paying coal mining and manufacturing jobs. We have this lack of opportunity, economic mobility, and social capital, as I think most West Virginians are well aware. Poor housing quality and affordability, and then violence. Fortunately, violence, except in some neighborhoods throughout the state, is not so much of a problem. But in other places like the west side of Charleston, for example, that you have a lot more violence. And so it's this built environment. Another way to kind of look at this is adverse childhood experiences is what happens behind the front door. So in your home. The adverse community environments are things that happen beyond your front porch. And so the other aspect of this is that we have this thing called the social determinants of health, and that's really another name for adverse community environments, and includes things like things we've already talked about, economics, but includes access to healthy foods, the built environment, whether you have parks next to you, whether you live in a crime-ridden neighborhood or not, and access to good education.
Okay, great. Thank you for that explanation. We're going to turn to Maddie for a second and see if we have any questions on Facebook.
No questions so far, Kelly.
Okay, great. Thank you, Maddie. So these adverse community environments over time can create intergenerational trauma. And can you share a few examples of what you mean by that?
Yeah, so we used to think of biology as nature versus nurture. And right now we understand that there is a vastly greater interplay between nature versus nurture. So for example, what I'm talking about here are the things you're exposed to after you're born, what family you're born into, and all the things that we've kind of just talked about. The nature part of that is the genes we're born with from our biological parents. So that we used to think those two things were strictly separated. Now we know through the study of epigenetics, which I'll talk about shortly, that these two things are much more intertwined than we originally thought, or at least when I was going to in medical school back in the late 1980s. So one of the ways to look at this, and I love this diagram because it really kind of helps you explain things very well. So you see this thick black line that goes through both of these pyramids. That's conception, when we're born. And then once we are born, we are exposed to these adverse childhood experiences. And sometimes we have children coming home from the hospital and they have an E-score of 4 just walking through the front door. If they're, coming to a single parent household, if somebody's been incarcerated, using drugs, having problems with mental illnesses. So there's already a challenge there for those people. That leads in turn to a number of social, emotional, and cognitive impairments. And we know, you'll see on the left-sided pyramid that there's these arrows with scientific gaps. We filled in a lot of those gaps now. We understand that the brain works in a certain way. We'll probably talk about that a little bit later. But these adverse childhood experiences affect our brains in certain ways and are driven through our bodies through something called the hypothalamic, pituitary, and adrenal axis. So that's the axis that connects our brain all the way down through the rest of our body. So these changes can be driven into us. These impairments then lead to the adoption of health risk behaviors. And this is, for me, really a eureka moment in medicine to understand, why don't people understand that smoking is harmful for you? Why don't people understand that drinking too much alcohol? I thought there was enough information out there about that. Don't people know drugs are bad? Why do they keep doing it if they know it, it's destroying their lives? But when you look at it through the lens of adverse childhood experiences, these are people's way to try to ameliorate suffering. And what kind of suffering I'm talking about perhaps physical pain, emotional pain, or psychological pain. All of those things can lead somebody to try to relieve the pain in some way. So let me ask you a question, is there an advantage to taking a puff off of a cigarette? Well, a lot of people would say, well, yeah, you get a break from your work or from some other stressful event. But the truth also is that within a cigarette, there's a psychoactive drug called nicotine, and nicotine can help us, at least for a very short period of time, feel better. Do people with high scores know that smoking is bad for them? Of course they do. But there's the draw of that puff off the cigarette and the relief of that pain. Same way with alcohol. Alcohol, is there a benefit to doing that? Well, a lot of people like to enjoy adult beverages, and they feel this sense of relief, this disinhibition, and you feel an easing of the tensions in your life. And there's a reason they call it happy hour because people, uh, like to get together and drink, and there is this relief. Does it do damage over the long term? Of course it does. It damages your relationships. It disrupts your sleep. And then, excess amounts can lead to legal troubles or even damaging your body through your liver and causing cirrhosis. Likewise, is there any benefit to injecting drugs? Well, you know, yeah, a lot of people really enjoy it. That's why they continue to do it. And when you hear people talk who inject drugs, they'll tell you they feel this tremendous relief. Everything else fades away. And one person even described it as kissing the face of God. So that's the kind of relief we're talking about. We all know that tobacco, alcohol, and drugs can become habitual. You get this chemical hook as well. I don't want to, negate that, but there's a strong behavioral component to doing this, to relieving the stress that is going on. So it was always a mystery to me, why is it so hard to get somebody to stop smoking? Why is it so hard to get somebody to stop drinking or using drugs? Well, it's because you're taking away their coping mechanism. And that is really a sort of a eureka moment. Unless we give people something to deal with the pain that they're having that's underlying all this, the adverse childhood experiences at the base of the pyramid, then it's really an uphill battle. Of course, we know that the adoption of these health risk behaviors leads to disease, disability, social problems. We've talked about that, which then leads to early death. So migrating over to the right pyramid, we see a similar thing with the black line, but below that, there are a couple of different layers there. At the very bottom, there's this generational embodiment and historical trauma. And, I think we can think of a lot of examples of historical trauma. African Americans who were enslaved, and that traumatic experience then is passed down through the genes, through epigenetics, which I'll explain in just a moment. Holocaust survivors, people who've lived for more than a couple of generations in some of West Virginia's most impoverished communities. These are all historical traumas. And then there's the local context and social conditions we talked about before with adverse community environments. And then you see this line on the right with microaggressions, this and the implicit bias that's contained in microaggressions. I've had a chance when I lived in Hawaii, because there's no majority race in Hawaii, to experience that on my own, not very often, but that it's damaging when it happens. And then we'll talk for just a minute about epigenetics. So we're all born with a complement of genes from our mothers and fathers, and those, we can't change the genes. But within the genome, we have segments of our genes where the genes are either turned off or on based on the experience, not only of our own lives, but those of our ancestors. And so if our ancestors, for example, had been starving, that turns certain genes off and on. If we've been exposed to repetitive trauma or even this historical trauma, then certain genes are turned off and on. And in one study, they were actually able to show that some African Americans were carrying genes for post-traumatic stress disorder, but the key was it was triggered by an adverse childhood experience. So that gene was there, and it got turned on by the adverse childhood experience, leading to this sort of cascading effect. Very interesting. And also, it's not only the stress of our parents. This can be even conveyed in a study from Tufts with mice. They were looking at mice with reduced levels of sperm microRNAs. And so the higher the ACE score, the lower the level of these microRNAs that are in the sperm. And so the stress from the father was transmitted into the mice, as well as into the men who were doing this. So they were able to do a parallel model with mice and with human beings. In the mice, the sustained trauma changes in the mice lasted through 3 generations of mice. And so I think it's not a mystery that something similar is happening in human beings as well.
That's really interesting. And Maddie's going to share a link in the comments below on the study at Tufts. Maddie, do we have any questions or comments on Facebook?
Yes, we have a couple.
I think we might have lost you, Maddie. Are you still there?
Can you hear me, Kelly?
Now we can, yes.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so sorry. The first question is, are you finding that babies born with NOS are having higher ACE scores?
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack in that. That's an excellent question. So babies who are born with neonatal abstinence syndrome, also called neonatal opioid withdrawal syndrome, or NOWS, are automatically having a score of 1, right? Because their mother was using intravenous drugs. So we're often finding that the effects of the drugs are bad enough on the children, but they're compounded by the fact that many of these children, if they go home to their biologic parent or parents, are exposed to even more ACEs. So the interplay between the drugs that the baby is withdrawing from and the effects of living in a house where there's constant stress is hard to tease out. And those studies still have to be done. And I don't know of anybody right now who's doing those. It's an excellent question. But the short answer is that there is definitely an interplay between those two things, and it's a tragedy that's playing out every day in our state.
Okay, thank you. And then another question is, what are ways to build effective resiliency that leads to skills that allow a person to live well with ACEs?
Yeah, that's a good one. Well, there's some things that you can change in your environment, right? I mean, if you are able to escape or somehow change your household, then you can definitely improve your outlook, because automatically you're moving to a new neighborhood where things are better, where there's less stress from those adverse community environments. So those are some of the things that you can change, which are very difficult, of course, for people to be able to do. It's really interesting. There's a student I worked with in the WVU School of Public Health who's working on her doctorate there. Her name is Brittany Smith, and she's from Kanawha County, and she did a study, very innovative study, looking at mothers and their children who had been using drugs in the past, and comparing those with mothers who had not been using drugs and their children. And they found that the ACE scores were higher in the group that had been using drugs and higher on average in their children. But there was something also very, very interesting to getting at the answer to this, is that among some of the mothers who had been using drugs, they had a wide variance in some of their children. So some of their children had grown up with very high ACE scores, and others had very low ACE scores from the same mother. And that happens when you go into recovery, right? Those children are brought into a different environment where there's fewer ACEs. And so it's very interesting in that way. But there's other things too. There are other programs that are out there. The Triple P program, I forget what the first P parenting program that helps mothers deal with issues better. The nurse home visiting programs are very good for that. But then there are other things to do as well. We know that, for example, one thing that helps us re-regulate a runaway hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis that I talked about before. And again, it's that connection between the brain and the rest of our body. One of the best medicines you can give for your body is exercise. And exercise helps you grow new neurons in your brain. It helps you regulate this neurohormonal axis that I was just talking about. And it helps you in a wide variety of ways. So exercise is really good. The other thing that works in a very similar way, believe it or not, is meditation. Studies done with mindfulness meditation have shown that people can help regulate their executive functioning, improve their executive functioning, reduce the reactivity. And so there are really a lot of things that you can do. And so while we're talking about ACEs in the opioid crisis, it's typically a very sort of dark subject. But I want you to know that the same things that harm our bodies through adverse childhood experiences, namely the ability to change our genes, turn them off and on, and the plasticity within our brain can be changed by positive experiences as well. So it's a double-edged sword. The things that can hurt us can also help us feel better. I mean, the same basic physiologic functions. So it's a really interesting thing. There's also another absolutely fascinating part of this story relating to our genes that we're going to get a little technical here for just a moment. I hope you don't mind, but our genes have chromosomes. Chromosomes are the structures that where our genes are contained in, and there's caps on the ends of those chromosomes, and those caps are called telomeres. Telomeres, and the person who discovered telomeres and their role. So we found out that stress, when the telomere gets shorter, when we get stressed, our telomeres get shorter, and that leads to cell death. So stress shortens our telomeres. And the person who did that, I think her name is Elizabeth Blackburn, she won the Nobel Prize for discovering that. But it's interesting, and so toxic stress can affect us right down to the subcellular level to our very genes, right? So, but the other part of that is that something like meditation actually helps maintain the telomeres, meaning that the cells don't die as fast, and probably has a positive biologic effect at the whole person level, not just at the gene level. So a lot of things at play here, but the short answer is yes, there are many things that give a person a reason to hope that they can get better.
Thank you. And that was the last question so far.
Great. Thank you, Maddie. So we'll go back to our standard questions to continue on with the discussion on how trauma affects us in biological ways. How does traumatic stress alter how we think?
Well, so that affects us through our brains, right? And so I'm glad, perfect, you brought up the brain model here. So we have this part of our brain, and I'm not trying to give an anatomy lecture or neuroanatomy lecture of the brain here, but our brains do many wonderful things for us, obviously. The front part of our brain, called the prefrontal cortex, is where we have a lot of executive functioning. And then we have this sort of deeper part of the brain in the middle here, where you see it's called the limbic system. We're not going to remember the names of these structures, except for two. The two I want to talk about are the hippocampus, which is interesting. It's Latin for seahorse because it kind of looks a little bit like a seahorse if you look at it. That purple thing there in the picture. The hippocampus is the part of the brain that helps us consolidate short-term into long-term memory. So very important for learning and remembering things. And then there's this little part of the brain, I'm trying to find it, not the hypothalamus, but part of, there it is, the amygdaloid body. The amygdala is a part of the brain that's scanning our environment all the time for threat. So when we're constantly exposed to threat, we get something called hypervigilance. We see this in military personnel all the time who are out on missions and they have to stay alert and awake. But then it's hard for them when they get back to civilian life to turn off that hypervigilance. And that leads, the short answer is that it leads then to this hyperarousal state. And so these, the amygdala may seem like an enemy because it's doing these things that keep us hyper-aroused, but it was a necessary survival mechanism for our brain because we were scanning the environment for threat all the time when there were things like bears out there. that we had to be aware of and had to be able to either fight, flee, or sometimes, it helps, it makes us freeze up, which is obviously not a desired outcome. And you'll see that happen with children. You'll see it happen with adults. After they've been traumatized so many times through any number of these childhood traumas that we already talked about, sometimes you see people freeze up. And that's what's happening. Basically, the amygdala has hijacked the brain and shut down the executive functioning. And I think a lot of us have experienced that. We've experienced that when we're in an argument with somebody, where our brains just kind of freeze up. And we've all had that experience where we've gotten into some sort of verbal altercation with somebody, and they're saying all these mean and hurtful things to us, and then kind of later on, 20 minutes later in the shower the next morning, we think of all these very clever responses we might have had. Well, that's because at the time the amygdala had hijacked our brains. So that's one of the ways that we see people who have been traumatized over and over. It's one thing if you're looking out for bears, but it's a different sort of thing if the bear comes home every night and is drunk, and you feel that you're being threatened on a constant basis, and that leads not only to this problem with taking over the brain and freezing up, but also impairs the memory of people. So they often don't remember. And we see this, like even with sexual trauma, people don't remember the details, and you see these women who have had to recount in very public ways about some sort of sexual trauma that they've had, and they don't remember the details. And mostly it's the men who are sitting around going, well, what, you couldn't remember that? Don't you think that's an important detail? Well, yeah, but there's a reason they can't remember it. It's because the amygdala hijacked their brain. They never encoded that memory because of that experience. Likewise, it also leads to a decrease in the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the front part of our brain. It's the executive functioning part of our brain that helps us think through complex situations. And we just lose that skill. And you'll see it, on the street. People who are walking down the street and they're reacting. It's the difference between things that happen to us where we can respond and other instances where people just react. And you'll see they'll start screaming and yelling. And another example of when our amygdala, for example, hijacks our brain is road rage. If somebody cuts us off or almost hits us, and then boom, there's all of these sort of profanities or obscene gestures or bad thoughts about the other people. And again, it's a great example of the amygdala hijacking the brain. But if you do it repeatedly over time, it really downregulates your learning, your memory, and affects your entire body, because again, your brain is connected through your body, not only through your neck, but also through this neurohormonal axis, where the hypothalamus secretes stimulating hormones that activate our adrenal glands.
Okay, so how does that affect these? You had mentioned it before, risky behaviors. So how does all of this kind of affect some of the bad choices or risky ones that we may make?
Yeah, so that's another great question, and it has a lot to do with the prefrontal cortex, right? Our executive decision-making process in the prefrontal cortex is impaired. We become more reactive, and then it leads us to choices. And again, we're back to the pyramid here again. It leads us to high-risk choices that are ways that we try to ameliorate this sort of suffering that we have from being constantly stimulated by everything in our environment. And people are looking for a way to kind of relax because they can't auto-regulate any longer. They've no longer have the ability to make good executive decisions. Now, I want to say something too that's also very clear. I'm not trying to blame all bad behavior on adverse childhood experiences. I'm not trying to blame the entire opioid crisis on adverse childhood experiences. But I'm going to introduce a term called population attributable risk. And that's an epidemiological term. You don't need to know what it means, except to know that it's the amount of something, some factor that will cause bad outcomes later or has an influence on another factor. And what I mean by that is if we were able to take away ACEs entirely, for example, we would reduce and by one study, we would reduce the opioid intravenous drug use problem by 78%. The population attributable risk of ACEs on the use of IV drugs is 78%, meaning that the majority of problems out there are related to adverse childhood experiences when it comes to the opioid crisis. And there are many studies that have shown that linkage between ACEs and the opioid crisis, and all the way back to the original ACEs study. Now, again, it's important to know that not everybody who uses drugs has had this horrible background. And what we don't want to do is to stigmatize the parents, because they may have done everything in their power, and many of them have given their children every opportunity in the world to grow and excel. And despite that, some of them go on to use drugs either through experimentation, or they had an injury that led them to use opioids and then became addicted that way. But again, on a population basis, looking at the state of West Virginia, the biggest chunk of the opioid crisis is related to ACEs. And if we don't deal with ACEs, we're going to have the next generation and the next generation and the next generation, maybe not with opioids, but we already know that this is a sort of shapeshifter. The drug crisis is changing all the time. A long time ago, it was methamphetamine. Then it became prescription opioids. Then people weren't happy with that. It shifted into heroin. And now it's fentanyl. And now methamphetamine is making a comeback. And who knows what else is coming down the pike. So we can't predict what the next drug will be. But we know that if we don't deal with this problem, ACEs, that we're going to continue to have a drug use problem in the state. And I really would hope that, and in the nation for that matter, would really hope that there are stronger efforts made to dealing with the underlying causes. And this is why, again, you asked me, Kelly, at the very beginning, how I got into this. Well, I was trying to look down the road, and as things began to unfold, it became clearer and clearer what was really underlying a lot of health problems, including the opioid crisis.
Thanks. So you've answered much of this, but I would like to ask it again and hope those who are watching perhaps could write something in the comment section if they have any ideas or feedback to share. How do you think generational ACEs and other determinants of health have played a factor in West Virginia's response to the opioid epidemic?
Yeah, so there's an interesting thing that I was a part of when I was the health director for the Kanawha Charleston Health Department. I didn't really want to go to it. It was called a poverty simulator. And, basically I said, well, I'll show up because I think maybe this is going to be interesting, and maybe not, maybe I'll just, go on my way. So the premise of this poverty simulator is that you're given a role to play. And for example, I was the oldest sibling in a household where my father had just gone to jail, not in real life, of course, but in the simulation, my father had gone to jail. I was responsible for taking care of two younger siblings. My father's income had stopped because he'd gone to jail. There were bills that were due. And, this went on for several hours where we had different circumstances thrown at us. And so you had to navigate all of these different social services. And then at one point, somebody held me up and took my money, as part of the game, of course. And I was broke and I didn't know what to do. And I was getting really, by the time this was all over with, I was very frustrated and I was very angry. And then it clicked. this must be, sort of what it's like when poverty kind of affects that. So the question was premised on what do these other factors have involved. If you're born in a family with ACEs, um, you may not have the same coping skills growing up in that family because they've not been demonstrated for you, right? That's how we learn. We learn from other people by how they behave. And if you grew up in that family that had decreased coping skills, then you yourself may not have the same set of skills. And so that kind of helps trigger that intergenerational. Now, add to that a state that has been hemorrhaging population. I can't remember what the number was from Kanawha County, but Charleston recently sank below 50,000 people, and people continue to leave the state because the economy is so bad. Coal is no longer being mined in the way it once was. It probably never will be again. And that leads to a collapsing community. So we talked about the built environment, right? One of those adverse community environments. When the built environment begins to collapse, schools get consolidated or move entirely out of your community, hospitals go away. It leads to what the Princeton researchers, Case and Deaton, called diseases and deaths of despair. And when you lose hope, then it becomes one more thing you have to deal with if you're already starting with adverse childhood experiences. So your capacity to handle those kind of adverse community environments lead you then to become more reactive. When you have children, they are then influenced by that behavior, and then the cycle kind of perpetuates. So you're watching, unfortunately, I think in many parts of the state, communities collapsing from the lack of access to food. You see in many smaller communities, the grocery stores are going away and Dollar General stores are popping up. Nothing against Dollar General, but they don't often hold the kind of nutritious foods that people need. Again, schools going away, hospitals shutting, all of these things lead people then to a place where, getting high is just an easy way out. You don't have to deal with that pain when you're high. And then when you are coming off your high and you see that things haven't changed, well, there's always another way out. You can always escape. You don't have to get in a car and drive somewhere. You can escape right in your own living room if you're using drugs. And so and these medicines that are so very helpful for helping with pain have been used to help people escape not only physical pain, but the emotional, the mental, as well as the existential pain of these kind of communities. So it becomes this sort of, combination of things, this sort of perfect storm of events that lead people and trap them in that. And so really, again, dealing with this community deterioration and trying to deal with ACEs, those things have to come hand in hand. We can't just go into a house and say, well, you have all these adverse childhood experiences and try to fix the family without considering that family is a product of their community and that the community may needs a lot of attention.
Wow, thank you. That's really a lot to think about. Maddie, do we have any questions or comments on the Facebook page?
No questions. We do have a few comments though. One, oh,
Are you still there? I can't hear you.
I think we may have lost her again.
there is another agreed, and I think acknowledging and treating people with respect and being honest with them. And I know with our NAS kiddos, we kid glove these parents and then judge them when they fail. My experience is when
Maddie, you're cutting in and out. I don't hear, I only hear about half of what you're saying. Could you maybe try again? Because I think we've lost you.
Up and rising ones. And then, do you agree with preventing babies born with NOS or now will help sectors across the board?
Okay, Maddie, I want to go. Can you hear me, Maddie?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so Maddie, I don't know if the listeners on Facebook caught any of that, but if I heard the question about addressing a neonatal abstinence syndrome, whether that would help, and it would, of course, across the board. But many of your comments were lost. You were kind of cutting in and out, and so I don't know that we heard all of it. So could you start at the top again?
So sorry, I think my Wi-Fi is failing me a bit. But starting at the top, it said this epidemic has caused extra stress and anxiety besides what is going on, and I think we need to address this too. And then someone agrees, and they said, I think that, and acknowledging and
Oh, Maddie, I think we're going to keep cutting in and out. So if,
So could I address some of this, Kelly?
huh?
Yeah, so I really like the comment about the opioid epidemic and how this has been just something that has put West Virginia into a tailspin. Um, and it's not just the drugs themselves; it's the epidemic of overdoses. It's the epidemic of neonatal abstinence syndrome. It's the epidemic of diseases like HIV that is now a new outbreak in Charleston, West Virginia. There was one in Huntington, West Virginia. Hepatitis C, hepatitis B. And so all of these things become compounding problems. And so I've coined the phrase epidemic of epidemics. We have all these intertwined epidemics. That was already on top of a state that was stressed from obesity, diabetes, chronic illnesses that are also related to ACEs. So this is yet another manifestation on top of the pre-existing problems. And when COVID goes away, which was of course another stress, and fortunately West Virginia has done better than many other states, thank goodness. But when that wave of COVID goes back, then we're going to be left with these other problems. And while COVID and the pandemic have been going on, the overdose epidemic in West Virginia has gotten worse. The drug epidemic will certainly have gotten worse. And like I said, the HIV problem in Charleston and Kanawha County and specifically has gotten much worse. So we're going to be dealing with the consequences of that for a very long time. And that's really the problem. We don't address the underlying problems. We're always putting out the fire. Instead of going after the arsonist, we just keep running around trying to put out all the fires. We have to go after the arsonist. And the arsonist in this case are the ACEs.
So
Without a doubt, also go ahead, Kelly, I interrupted you.
that's okay. I was just segueing. We have about 10 minutes left to a couple of things that I saw on our Facebook page. And they kind of fit into the next question. Do you believe that addressing ACEs is key to addressing West Virginia's historic addiction problem? And two people one brought up the ICE model, which you may want to mention, and the other brought up the importance of preventing unintended pregnancies.
Yeah. So the last one, unintended pregnancy. I'm writing these things down so I don't stray off topic too much. The ICE model. We have a great example of a country that has successfully dealt with their drug and alcohol problem in more than maybe any other country on the planet. And that's the country of Iceland. So the story, and we're lucky that in West Virginia that we have this researcher named Alfgeir Christensen in the West Virginia University School of Public Health. Outstanding guy, and as you might guess from his name, he's Icelandic. But Iceland in the 1990s was among the leaders in Europe, even though it's way out there in the middle of the North Atlantic, it's considered a European country. Um, was a leader in Europe in terms of cannabis use among their youth, alcohol use, truancy, bullying, all of these things that sound very familiar to Americans today. So what they decided to do was not to have an anti-drug campaign or an anti-alcohol or an anti-cannabis or anti-smoking campaign. What they decided to do is look at the social context of kids. So they knew that the age of first use of kids is a really important factor in this because again, our brains are developing when we're in adolescence and it's not till age 18 that we're fully developed. When kids start first use earlier, they have less of the necessary neurologic equipment to deal with that so that adults can make much better decisions. That's why we have a drinking age. Adults make much better decisions about their alcohol use than children do, obviously. And so what they were trying to do was simply to delay first use of the substance to win a period of time when they would have the wherewithal to make better decisions. Makes sense, right? So one of the things that they did to try to address this is knowing that the biggest influence on an adolescent is no longer their parent, it's their peer group. And they decided to make after school activities that would engage kids. Most of the time they were athletics, but could be any number of things. And they always did it with the presence of a responsible adult. And lo and behold, this worked in Iceland. They watched their rates of cannabis use, tobacco use, alcohol use, they all fell. And now Iceland is among the leaders in Europe. So they went almost from worst to first, which is a really thing that we would like to emulate in West Virginia. And there are communities in West Virginia who are implementing that ICE model. Now, the one thing is, it's not a bunch of researchers from WVU swooping into a community and telling you to do X, Y, and Z. This is a community-based initiative. What they do is they give the communities the tools to set up these programs, and then they help them with the research. The research helps inform the communities, and this is, community participation. They inform the communities then adjust their programs based on what the researchers found. So it's this interconnection between research and policy and implementation. Really, really very, very clever and elegant model and simple. We heard the saying, idle hands are the work of the devil. Well, it's true. We got to involve kids in something constructive and creative. Buy them time so that the age of first use, and that's what they were also able to show, that the age of first use shifted to almost 2 years later. So that's a big difference in terms of kids' brain development. Unintended pregnancies, that was the other comment, I think, Kelly, that you brought up. Yeah, that's another consequence of adverse childhood experiences. We know that girls who have high ACE scores are more likely to be sexually abused and more likely to experience sexual abuse as adults too. So this is one of those things. People become sexually active at an earlier age, and then have these unintended pregnancies. And this is undoubtedly one of the consequences of the ACEs problem that we have. And by the way, West Virginia, it does statistically, from a 2016 study, West Virginia is a statistical outlier for high ACE scores. And we have 3 states that had 1 or more ACE scores between ages 0 and 5. And that was Arizona, Oklahoma, and West Virginia. We were the 3 states, but we are in all of these categories of 2 or more ACEs, whether it was age 0 through 5 or age 0 through 17, West Virginia was a statistical outlier.
Thanks. So we have a few minutes left, and it always seems to happen that we spend so much time talking about ACEs, we don't spend enough time talking about resilience. You talked about resilience a little bit at the beginning. What suggestions do you have to cultivate resilience?
Yeah, so some of the things I've already spoken about, and I think we have plenty of time to talk about this. This is not negative, right? So we have the ability through the ICE program to get kids engaged with one another, to build healthy bodies through exercise, but also building stronger social connections in a setting where there is a responsible adult and they can build these healthy connections. Again, if you come from a family where this is not being demonstrated, it's difficult to do and it takes time to be able to relate to people in a socially appropriate way if you've never had those skills. A lot of kids feel defective. You know, they think that they're alone, that there are nobody else around them with high ACE scores, but it's not true. Engage their minds, engage their bodies in exercise. Schools that are doing things around meditation are having excellent outcomes in terms of not only academics, but also behaviors as well. And again, there are many other community level programs like this nurse home visiting program and other programs that are available to kids and to families to help them build better and to, you know, establish that level of resiliency. Now, I will say that in order for us to grow, we all need to experience tough things. That's part of our experience. The trouble is for the kids with ACEs, they're already at such a deficit that they often never recover from these things that make most of us grow. We always look at this dark side of, you know, post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, and not look at things that are demonstrable like post-traumatic growth. Um, but giving kids that equal platform, building them up, the kids who've experienced the highest number of ACEs and who live in the most impoverished communities. But it also takes, to build resilience, we also have to think at a community level about community resilience and the things that we can do. Supplying jobs is one of the things. It's easy to say, hard to do. Making, you know, establishing educational foundations for kids, not monetary foundations, but reading to kids at an early age. All of these things help. And whenever you have a chance as an adult to mentor kids, please do that. And that makes such a difference to know that there's somebody out there who cares for you and loves you. And that's, at the end of the day, that's what every child wants. They want to know that they're loved and that they're valued.
Thanks. You know, I think that a natural progression from this Facebook Live would be to have one just solely focused on resilience, and then some of the good things that people are doing in their own communities to try and build that sense of community back. And I know a couple of them are watching now, so I hope we can convince them to join us. So do you have any parting words before we go, Mike?
No, I just would like to thank everybody for listening to me ramble on. Again, it's something I could talk about for hours on end.
Well, we appreciate your time. I want to thank you. I want to thank Maddie, and I'm sorry that your Wi-Fi wasn't working very well tonight, Maddie. And thanks to all who joined us. Keep an eye on our Facebook page. I think Maddie's already shared some links to more information on this topic. And I think one of the links she shared was on a number of programs around cultivating resilience from the state of California, they've really taken on ACEs as a public health crisis and responding to it. So we have a lot to learn from their policies as we move forward. So we'll post this video on our YouTube channel tomorrow morning. So be free to share it with your colleagues and friends. And if you have any questions, let us know. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great evening.